Thank you for joining me and onwards with contentious questions and maybe different ways of deliberating how to answer them. I'm going to talk about a little bit of what I was kind of hinting at last video with giving ourselves time to almost think of the growing pains that are involved in wanting to maintain traditional values and trying to acclimate to whatever the secular kind of culture is, and then taking a postmodern approach, and then integrating diversity in all of that, and then wanting not to just be tolerant, but accepting of a lot of different ways, and then knowing how to think about all that as your own personal identity so that you don't lose yourself. And then you're kind of one of these people who, I accept everything. I'm like laissez-faire where I'm allowing everything. But then for my own personal identity, I haven't really built a boundary or a standard yet. So I'm going to start with adopted kids because there's one chapter where it's called Al-Ahzab, which means like the Confederates or like the faction. So it almost talks about the beginning part of what could be is precipitating itself into a civilization or somewhat of a like a forming community. So we went from kind of primitive and just trying to understand what is oneness in the world. How are we supposed to think about the universe? How are we supposed to think about each other and what our practices are? And then what can we improve upon? What can we keep? And what can we kind of remove and replace with something else or just completely remove and not kind of replace with anything? So if you think about, uh, I'm going to kind of align this with the founding fathers as I'm going. So you think about the founding fathers, and when they came to North America, there was already the native community. So they have their language and their culture. And we don't have to assume that they were all cohesive. Like they might have been warring already within each other. The Khan Academy actually has a free, uh, actually several free courses that include native history or like American history. And a few years back, I studied or I took like some time off and I just kind of followed through with what the American history was. And it's really informative. It's really easy to digest. So I recommend that for anybody who's kind of curious about what American history looked like. And so, uh, if you think of people from France coming to North America, you think people from England, you think people from Spanish. These are three also different cultures and very distinct languages. And then you have the natives, and now these are maybe these like three are already kind of warring, and then the natives maybe have wars, and they're all trying to kind of figure out a way to live together, and they don't understand each other. So that's kind of like you can kind of parallel that with Muhammad's story that we're going to kind of follow, and going from Mecca to Medina, which is they all speak Arabic, so that's already I think like a common denominator. But now they have to understand different cultures. So there's some who are pagans, there are some who are Jewish, or some are Christian, and then there's the new kind of forming monotheistic religion that's trying to allow all of them to exist, but is trying to focus on the pagan community and saying, these idols that you worship may actually deter and hinder you from progressing in the world, and we're going to find out why. So, with the understanding of Queen Sheba and King Solomon, you can almost see how those were like really, really two big kingdoms that God kind of gave as a scenario. And then you have Arabia, which is just kind of one population, but then you have around it, there's kind of parts of Africa, kind of like North Africa, and then the Byzantine, and then the Roman Empire. And so it's almost like the entire area around Arabia is somehow forming, but you don't really know how yet. And without them maybe knowing what's going on in Arabia, we don't really know, or maybe we do know what's going on within those cultures sort of around it. So within Arabia, if they're having their inner conflict, what is happening around kind of its perimeter, as it were, the circumference? So that could be something that's kind of like a history lesson for people who are interested. But if we think now with uh, how families are kind of integrating outside of, the politics and trying to understand how to form communities, if we have no rights for how children are kind of treated, how women are treated, how interrelations are kind of maintained, um, any of that almost assumes like we're losing lineage, we're losing people's wealth, maybe. All of that is in flux, and you kind of have to wonder, like, wow, we kind of don't have a standard for what to understand that to be. Kind of. I mean, the closest approximation we have are the founding fathers, and if you look at what they kind of established, one of them or one of the kind of rights that they wanted to maintain was the right to bear arms or to kind of have some kind of form of self-defense. And at the time, it was because, I mean, as we're kind of developing, the only thing that can communicate really, like, be careful with my boundary and don't trespass, is a weapon, right? So you say, regardless of whether or not we understand each other, if I feel like I'm threatened because you're coming too close, or, you're trying to threaten me or I'm trying to threaten you, this is almost something to say, we got to slow down and we got to figure out a way to communicate. So now come back to the recent times right now, and you think, okay, well, I mean, do we really still need weapons? And some people say yes, some people say no, some people say it's just a preventative measure so that people don't assume, well, because you look like you're defenseless, we can just aggressive upon you, right? You're just so busy, like your kind of cerebral intellectual work that, if we find we can't rationalize with you, and we are kind of expedient, we'll just assume we can remove the face of the earth. No, that's not really ideal. I don't think anybody wants to think that way in this day and age. But if you think about it in a way of, we can't think globally in kind of like a hegemonic kind of perspective where we think everyone should be the same or generalize to that degree without allowing for nuance. So you can say, okay, maybe within some Muslim communities, we want to agree that we want to be peaceful, but we do need to have our defense, and like we want to have some kind of military so that we understand that, in the future, people who want to kind of submit to a kind of scholarly way of living, that there are other people who are there to kind of defend that and allow for that to happen safely in case we come across, contentious issues such as these, like they're sort of um, preserving their freedom of expression and free speech so that when, kind of questions around dogma and tradition come up, people don't say, well, you're threatening our way, and then they want to aggress. And then these people are thinking, well, we're still thinking about it. So how do we defend ourselves? So the idea is we just have to defend life anyway. And the scholars have to be defended because these are the people who are committed or just have that affinity for that intellectual work. So we almost have to have that kind of in place. So it's kind of curious because then you think, okay, so, people in around the world who kind of aren't sure how to think about um, gun control or owning guns, they might kind of want to revisit how they think about this. Like in a kind of civilized world, some people might say, the idea of having one's really, really scary. For me personally, I never really considered having one. I never thought I'd need one. We have one narrative of Omar who, because he was known to be so just, but he was also very fierce, he didn't have like a security detail around him. So one time he was having a nap under a tree, and one of the companions or his friends was walking by, and he just kind of looked at him and kind of like in wonder, and he's just like, Omar, you judge or you rule, and you do so with justice. And because you do so with justice, you're at peace. And then so you're able to sleep, which means you don't have a guilty conscience. Like you're just like, this is the extent of what I can do. And you know what? If God decides that I have to die or be killed or whatever, then so be it. He did end up actually um, being stabbed in the back while he was in prayer. So he became somewhat of a martyr anyway. But it just says something about the fact that it, wanting these political positions or wanting to be a ruler or to govern, it does look prestigious and it does look like it has this kind of allure. But if you think about it, it's such a huge and like weighty responsibility. Like you think, like who would really want that, right? In a democratic world, it might be a little bit different now because you're thinking, I'm engaging in progress. So I'm almost listening and I almost have like you can think of like a stethoscope to see like what's the heartbeat or like the pulse of the community or the country that I was born in and that I love being a part of. And I want to listen to what the people want and I want to almost allow for that to exist. So I want to kind of bring it to fruition. Right? It's such a organic way of wanting to exist in the world because you think we're building our heaven. So like why are we opposing it if we are used to maybe a top-down approach or authoritarian approach? like, why can't we step back from that and say, yeah, let's try to understand what the people want, and we are the people, like, so we can continually build forward. So if you think now of adopted kids, uh, outside of, let's pretend with the founding fathers, we had, the higher class and maybe like people who were enslaved, and then somewhere in the middle, they're all without rights, really. So people could maybe have out of wedlock children, or children who, I don't want to say illegitimate, but they maybe were children of mothers who may have been enslaved. So their rights are kind of like in flux. Like, where do we put this child? And so that's basically where Prophet Muhammad was with his scenario of uh, having a friend who married a woman who divorced her, and then Muhammad ended up marrying that woman. So his name was Zayd, and he was actually enslaved. And I don't know, we don't know the story, I think, of how he became a slave, but he ended up staying with Muhammad for a fair amount of time, and Muhammad adopted him. And he called him Zayd ibn, the son of Muhammad. But then later, a revelation was kind of revealed to say you have to maintain his own name. Even if you adopt him to, like, it becomes kind of like foster care. You may adopt him to kind of care for him and kind of protect his rights, but he has to keep his name so that he can follow his own lineage, and none of that gets lost, because that's important to kind of have like a historical place in your own kind of subconscious as you kind of go through life, and it kind of gives you a grounding with how to understand yourself. So after that verse was revealed, he gave him back his name. I think it was Zayd ibn Haritha. And it's really curious because after his father, Zayd's father and uncle were found Zayd, they were actually looking for him to try to free him. Like, how did you get sold into slavery? Like, we're here to rescue you, or to kind of bring you back home. And he chose to stay with Muhammad. He's like, no, no, like, I love the way I've been treated with spending time with him, that even if I was to stay as a slave, he wasn't, he was actually freed, but he's like, I'd still prefer to stay with him as like a friend or as a companion. And so he did. So it almost suggests, in the last video I talked to, or I left a link to the farewell sermon, and it includes a lot of these ideas that for anybody reading would be like, wow, like, I can't believe the things that they had to go through, and because of the way that wording is. It talks about like women in bondage, and it talks about freeing people, and that, men and women have rights, and the way it seems like it's a very, very primitive culture. So you think, how do you bring this to like 1400 years in the future and think about it with like a civilization? And it's still kind of the same. Like, you think, um, we want to maintain uh, rights for children who are uh, born in somewhat of a contentious issue scenario, by remembering how their emotional kind of quality of life needs to remain, right? So they don't need to have a negative sort of self-worth or idea of who they are. And that's actually going to be, if they do, it's going to be a reflection of what society is and what the status quo is. And then that's kind of like indicative of like, okay, well, what as a society do we have to work on? I think so. Okay, so we're thinking about rights of children. We're thinking about rights of women, who tend to be kind of the weaker population. And we're thinking about, God is saying that they need to have rights maintained. And then those who are in power, who maybe inherit these children or these women because of, war or whatever it is. And I mean, the people at the time don't really know how to think other than these people are property. They're called people that your right hand possesses, which means, uh, people have like this metaphorical understanding of God having a hand. And so it's almost to say, be compassionate with them, right? So if you want God to be compassionate with you, be compassionate with those who are almost under your care, is the kind of idea that if you read that, you can kind of try to view it with that context. So now you think, okay, if we come back to kind of, I don't know, somewhere maybe 100 years ago, I think America's history is maybe about 200 years. So if we go to maybe 100 years ago, and you think, there are communities that have old money, right? So like these traditions, or these families who just have money that's just kind of recycling itself through time and it maintains itself in some way. Some people will argue that this is, they're just families who marry each other. So if you think of Wedding Crashers, you can kind of see that scenario where um, children are almost assumed to align with what the parents want as values to maintain the money and the power and the prestige within a community. So it's almost like marriage may not actually be for love. It might be, no, this is kind of what's convenient and it's kind of like a business partnership more than anything. And it's a way to kind of propel that into the future. So that's fine because that's naturally a way of thinking into civilization. Like, how do we protect our wealth? How do we protect our name or our lineage? Or if you're understanding now, like people who may have believed in life and death and reincarnation and trying to approximate. We want this to kind of remain in our future. I mean, that's pretty close approximation to how to reach that goal. If you think of like a more recent revelation or understanding of, well, what did Muhammad say about charity and being charitable? And God does say that charity always increases your wealth. It's never going to decrease. So I mentioned in one of my postmodern playlists, um, postmodern Islam playlists, I think it was the 10th or maybe the ninth video, how charity is something that is very difficult to account for. Like we can't really measure how God's going to metaphysically reward us for an action because especially if it emanates from the heart, I mean, we might not realize the depth of our sincerity and then what that ramification can actually have as kindness that spreads throughout the world. And, God rewards with it. So if we think of a family that has a lot of money and they've had it for several years, so they're almost accustomed to like an affluent way of life. And they have children now who are wondering about, well, maybe we don't want to marry with our cousins and we want to kind of step outside of that. They might be hesitant and maybe actually like completely resistant and say, no, there's no way. So you can align that with Romeo and Juliet now and say, yeah, that's like a pretty realistic scenario. Like, how would we deal with that? And these kids, if they're growing up with like a postmodern mindset, they probably will have the backing and the support to, I don't want to say it seem threatening to like their grandparents, but it's almost like we don't want to resort to violence, right? We want to have, the safe way of being able to persuade each other of our perspectives and not kind of getting in each other's way or sabotaging anyone's kind of integrity for life or sabotaging how they feel about themselves. So the reason I mention violence is because assume that in one of these affluent families, you have a mother that gets pregnant and she's struggling with, I have this child, but I also have a um, a family or a tradition that won't recognize that this baby is going to be legitimate because I'm not married. So what would our reaction be if she decided, no, I'm going to carry again because maybe my life will be threatened as like an honor killing, depending on the family. So that's almost like, whoa, like we wouldn't have even thought that. And that's typically the reaction. It's like we assume this form of authority with men and understanding how to use weapons and understanding how to kind of defend themselves. But then when you put that picture with a woman, it's just stark. It's like it almost kind of gives us like this, it's like one of those pauses where it's perplexing and you kind of have to think about like, I understand that the need for these koans as they are, or these parables that are often given as examples in the Quran that force you to stop and think about your reality. And I mean, what ideas are you habituated to that you're maybe not realizing that you need to kind of stop and think about, I have to revise. So it's a valid question to me because I think about maybe not my nieces, maybe my nieces, maybe their cousins, maybe their friends, maybe like the next generation after them. If they are from affluent families and they decide, yeah, we don't want to intermarry and we don't really care if the money comes or goes. Like people can make money in so many different ways now. It's not something they need to worry about. But they have these parents or these kind of structured families that will sort of tamp down or try to hide the fact that, you're being postmodern and we won't accept that. So then you have to kind of like, if not for my own generation, I have to think about the future generation. And if I'm someone who wants to be in a political office, this is like a legitimate question. Like sometimes people who aren't familiar with a certain tradition, they'll feel kind of hesitant to kind of give any kind of rulings and say, well, the priests or the pastors or the um, ministers or sheikhs or rabbis or whoever they are within their community. I mean, they would be uh, more given the right to kind of give these rulings and kind of decide, what would you conclude from this scenario? And then we kind of take that to like the political office or the platform and then figure out like, okay, well, how do we go forward with this if we need to intervene? Right. But now it's almost like, well, we can't really allow that to happen because maybe they're reinforcing the zeitgeist without realizing it. So it's important to understand maybe the place of Catholic schools or of having, options for world religion and studying like what is the reason for wanting to allow these traditions to exist because the values are what they are, their values. But understanding that I mean, as humans, we all embody these values to different degrees, and it's just how we choose to identify as a group to kind of maintain some kind of social bond that we affiliate with a religion, as it were. Like, so I can say I'm Muslim just because when I go travel, it's easy for me to find a time and place that's comfortable for me. So if I say I'm looking for a mosque, people will say, "Oh, here's one," or I can just find one on Google, and then I already have somewhere to kind of rest, find someone to kind of talk with, and then I go from there, right? For anybody else, it might be a church. For somebody else, it might be like a entertainment district, right? We all have these kind of placeholders in life that are kind of go to when we are out of place and time, and we just need to kind of go there as a pit stop to kind of collect ourselves and then move forward. So if you think of that now, it's almost like, wow, this is like there's so much to think about here, and like it's a good thing because you can think we're not in the midst of a civilization that's falling or rising, really. It's just that there's just so much change that happened in such a short amount of time that it's like if everybody actually gets involved and starts to think about ways to kind of contribute, especially with like the internet and social media, it's like it won't take time at all, much time at all for us to kind of understand what to be accepting of and then allow ourselves the time to kind of integrate who we as an individual identity want to become. So with the idea of I mentioned in one of the videos the we maybe haven't relied enough on hardcover or hard kind of copies of scripture or literature because of technology. So just throwing the idea out there of having a lot of universities have community uh, library cards where even if you weren't an alumni or somebody who went to the university, you can still go back and ask for these library cards where you can access the computers and then you can access all this information. Then you can kind of look back and decide for yourself, like maybe I do want to do kind of like a personal study of, what tradition was around Muhammad's time or around Jesus' time, or maybe before that, and just kind of come to your own conclusion about what these questions can kind of lead to as answers. And then from there, we're kind of building a progressive way of thinking as a society because then you have letters to the editor, you can write, you can have columnists in journals and entertainment magazines, all of these things that are common for just any layperson or any person to just pick up and kind of read or pass an idea on to like maybe a radio station, and then it just becomes something that's part of our culture, and it's already like a niche somewhere, but it just needs to be kind of brought to the mainstream so that everybody feels like, oh, so I wasn't the only one thinking about it, but it's like everybody was thinking about it, but just doesn't know how to address it yet. So the idea of, again, just treating people who seem to be in these kind of weak positions or somehow compromised positions with kindness and compassion is almost kind of like the undertone of all of this because they tend to feel already like if you think of a shy person, right? You can kind of almost imagine that person. Like they're almost kind of like testing the waters and then going back because they already have this kind of mindset of, I'm so used to being judged, or I'm so used to being ostracized, or I'm so used to being, expected to comply with this set of norms or these standards. And now that I'm maybe stepping outside of it, are people going to be harsh with me? People may not even notice the change other than, hey, cool. Like, I'm glad you could join us, for example, if they're going out for drinks or anything like that. So I'm going to kind of stop there. I do want to segue a little bit into uh, how the idea of charity does give increase. And regardless of how we decide to allow our children to kind of branch out of what our tradition is, and that'll maintain the money anyway, because allowing love and compassion to nurture itself forward is being charitable, right? Charity in Arabic actually means to cleanse, right? So if you want to maintain your money and its place in the world for your own kind of revival in however many years in the future, that is the way to do it, is to be compassionate and to kind of allow for differences of opinion, to allow for that diversity within your family and then with others. And then in doing so, you'll be exhibiting that kindness, because when you think of charity, you think, I'm almost allowing myself to be a hand that gives rather than the one that's always asking, right? Sometimes we think people who are in power situations, or like these powerful seats of power, they tend to be expecting of others rather than the ones to maybe pro offer. So that's not to generalize. It's not always a scenario, but it's just something to kind of think about. It's like, oh yeah, I wonder how that is. And then you can think of philanthropy, and then you think of how that propels itself forward. So, um, kind of segueing into charitable ideas, with these kind of new questions, you'll have a lot of, uh, sometimes you'll have networks like TV networks who have FAQs or TV shows that are specifically geared towards allowing the community or the public to call in and ask questions to scholars or priests or ministers or sheikhs or whoever it is that has been studying this, and has a way of sort of creating analogies so that people feel secure in, like, we're holding our onto our values, but we're also allowing ourselves to progress in a kind of a postmodern way that's not going to create animosity within our families and friends. Then you kind of have to wonder about, like, what is there an etiquette around that? Like, people might feel shy, or they might feel like, oh my gosh, how am I going to be judged? How am I going to be? So for those who are taking in the calls or answering the questions, I think they already understand, these are very difficult questions. Sometimes they can maybe give really cut and dry answers. I don't know in a postmodern world how to address that, other than to say, usually these people who are calling are looking for that straight answer. But instead of always giving one, maybe the answer is, here's a commentary of what we've studied, of like what the tradition suggests. Here are some case studies or scenarios of what happened like recently, maybe, and then draw your own conclusion and see how any of this kind of affects how you might want to conclude based on what your actual personal life is. So, in doing so, it relieves the person who's answering the questions of having to kind of on the spot think of yes or no. And then, this person who's receiving the kind of answer, who's a caller, thinking, I don't like your answer. And then they go to another speaker who gives a different answer. And then you almost have like, well, why are you guys allowed to have different opinions? And then people call them like, we're we're almost shopping for rulings. Like, it's almost to say they're taking the spirit of the idea of we're looking for ease, and they're trying to find the most lenient way of understanding life, which is safe. Like, to me, I'd say, I mean, yeah, that's valid. But then as speakers or people who are kind of taking these questions in, if they already want to allow themselves to kind of give that kind of advice, then it almost kind of alleviates what that tension could kind of create within families who say, you're not allowed to agree. Well, this person's answer to be what we go with instead of this one. And then, it just alleviates a lot of that strife that could happen with arguing and, bias and all of that kind of getting in the way of trying to just create an easy solution for something that could be very easily resolved. So one of the things that I'm going to kind of leave us all with is, when I was at Guelph, I mentioned that I studied or I wrote a paper on sexual fantasies, and how sometimes we as students can kind of form a type of affinity for the people that are giving us advice, or that we feel safe almost confiding with. So we might build like a kind of like a sexual fantasy or a sexual identity with that person without wanting to act upon it, right? So this is something there's so many movies in Hollywood that kind of talk about this, where it's something that allows people to kind of step into their identity formation and how to understand their body and their sexual identity and what pleases them, what doesn't, right? It's a very safe and playful way of thinking and using your imagination. How that actually, so you pause there and then you think about how does that actually impact reality, right? Because I stopped the last video talking about how, one aesthetic, like, just really held himself accountable to the point of like wondering about where to stop his thoughts. So now you have these two extremes, and you think, well, I would assume this person wouldn't be judging of this young boy or girl, because he already knows that the way I built my ethic is I'm holding myself accountable. I'm not worrying about how other people hold themselves accountable and how they are in the world. So it becomes a very charitable way of just existing, where, they might find him later on in life or hear of him and then think, how would I be charitable with the way I'm asking a question or receiving an answer, or trying to engage with, trying to get to know another person from the opposite sex, or just maintaining relationships between men and women. Sometimes in some of these conservative communities, relationships between men and women tend to be very formal, and any kind of integrating between the two can sometimes feel awkward and a little bit stunted until they finally kind of relax into being able to understand how to get along without all that sexual tension being in the way. Uh, and that's basically it. Because with that, as we know, like scandal is something that's the story of Joseph is, I mean, a good example of how it's just going to be something that's through time, grappling with impulse control, uh, having some kind of esteem for yourself, first of all, and delayed gratification, and understanding how to be charitable with yourself. Like, so if I'm going to, come on to somebody who is already in a relationship, I have to think about what that's actually doing for my own personal future as it is before I think of how that might harm that couple. So if they're an unhappy couple, then, that's a completely different scenario. Lots of different questions to ask that kind of get more nuanced as we kind of delve into these questions. But I just figured because we are talking about the lifespan, it's very difficult to leave family out and all the ins and outs of struggles and questions that might prop up, but we just don't know how to talk about because we assume that they don't exist. So I'll leave it at that.